We're talking top fives. Before you guys start sharing your top fives, and I'll share mine as well. And for those of you who have never heard an episode of this show, each person goes down the list, 5 through 1, their favorite films from this person. Just give me your general thoughts on Tarantino. What he means to you, when you first encountered him, and what your relationship to his work has been over the last, what is coming up on 30 years?
Coming up on 30.
Coming up on 30 years.
Yeah, 92 was Reservoir.
Pretty
right?
incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, this is basically the span of our adult lives.
Yeah.
I have filmmakers that mean a lot to me, and I have filmmakers that even some of their movies I like more than Tarantino movies, for sure. There's no filmmaker that's as inextricable with my like personality than Quentin Tarantino. I mean, I love the movies of Paul Thomas Anderson. I don't long to talk like Paul Thomas Anderson characters.
You remind me a lot of the lead in The Master, though. You have kind of a similar affectation.
Yeah.
Well, I'll leave that to the audience to decide.
Jason, we were just talking before we started recording. We've talked about this on some rewatchables we've done about his movies. The impact that he had on the way people our age in high school and going into high school at that time had on basically how you communicated with the world and how you interpreted the world is kind of indescribable. And I know that might even seem nuts now to have like a cultural figure who does that. But in some ways, he was kind of like the last of the really big, iconic pop cultural artists who could shape your experience of the world, like Bruce Springsteen, Madonna, Prince, Steven Spielberg, like all these people who kind of shaped our idea of like entertainment and also the way you interface with the real world through that entertainment. I've said this, like I talk the way I talk because of Quentin Tarantino movies. It's not like I think that's cool, but it's undeniable. He introduced me to 80% of what I love.
So what do you mean when you say that? Do you mean the cadence? Do you mean the fact that you're always referencing pop culture? What specifically?
Fast, profane, smart. I'm not trying to be like, but like mixing high and low, like talking about knowing that there are people out there who care as much about like French New Wave cinema as they do about blaxploitation movies, as about dime store detective novels and Russian literature. And you kind of constantly like zipping around and like creating a narrative out of other narratives and out of other texts, which especially living on the internet the way we do is you're kind of constantly in touch with all these different tabs of culture. And that feels more relevant now than even it did in 1992 when it was much more like hard copy, piecemeal, putting it together with your hands. But I mean, what's your experience with it?
I saw Pulp and Res on the same weekend in high school from Blockbuster.
Hell yeah.
And it's hard to overstate, which I was saying off mic before. It's hard to overstate like what a bombshell the opening scene of Reservoir Dogs, when they're just talking, sitting around a table, these hitmen these thieves talking about what Madonna's Like a Virgin means metatextually. And I think what Chris was talking about was right. In terms of the way I processed it, which is this radical like democratization of culture. Like there was no such thing as, as highbrow or lowbrow. It's all the same brow and you can argue it in the same way. And it was the first time I can remember watching a movie and being like, oh, this is how people around me speak. This is what we talk about when we're sitting around BSing. We're talking about what does Like a Virgin mean? What does this song mean? That movie, who was in it? But who was like, wait, and what was the person who starred in that? Like that, these are the conversations you have. And the ability to tell a story through that was mind-blowing at the time. I'd never seen anything like that. I mean, that was my introduction essentially to cultural commentary.
I saw Pulp Fiction. My dad was a movie critic at the local newspaper in Philadelphia. He took me to a press screening of Pulp Fiction. And I remember you get out of the first diner scene and Dick Dale starts and the credits start rolling. And in the middle of the credit sequence, Kool and the Gang starts. Like the radio switches and Kool and Jungle Boogie starts. And I'm not kidding. I turned to my dad in the theater and I said, "Are you allowed to do that?" And he said, "Now you are." And he was not like a Quentin Tarantino stan. He was like, that was pretty good. I think it was like a little bit like vulgar for him. But that understanding that the rules are what you make them was also like hugely influential to me. Like the idea that like you can take this thing you love and do it the way you want to do it. And if you bet on yourself, you might be right.
The word audacious is often overused now, but at the time, particularly in the dialogue that you're talking about, Jason, and in the sort of structural design of a movie, he just changed a lot of rules, or he took rules from things like the French New Wave and made them more pop, made them more accessible. And the idea of jumping back and forth in terms of when you're telling a story, or the way that a soundtrack moves throughout a film and what that takes on a life of its own. That stuff, if it wasn't new, it felt new. And it always felt like he was doing something new, especially in that period that we're talking about. 92 through 97, 98, it was before everything felt from him like pastiche. And I think the pastiche stuff is great.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I love a lot of his later work. But the 90s in particular felt authentically original, for lack of a better phrase. And it felt like this stew that he had been mixing throughout the 80s, working in a video store. And, his biography is kind of legion at this point. We don't necessarily have to rehash all of that. But I had a very similar experience seeing Reservoir and seeing Pulp for the first time, just completely mind expanding.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll probably get into this when we get to these specific movies, but that period of time that you're talking about, to me, is a combination of the stuff that he liked to read, Elmore Leonard, crime fiction, whatever, and shit that like actually happened to him. Like weird valley stories, like parties that he went to that got really weird. A guy who OD'd in Glendale,
weed droughts,
weed droughts, like all that stuff. Like trying out for roles, like as an actor or whatever. Like all that stuff is like weird ephemera from someone's real life that then gets shot through this lens of like, what if there was this guy named Marcellus?
Yeah, hard genre. Yeah, putting the hard genre lens on the personal experience.
But like someone probably told him about a guy like the Gimp.
Yep.
Right. I never cared about dialogue before Quentin. It's like I wanted to see stuff blow up. I loved action movies. Quentin Tarantino movies, the first time I'm like, wow. Continue this conversation for another 20 minutes.
We did the Reservoir Dogs rewatchables. We got to best quote. We were just like, I don't know what you want me to say.
Print the script.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is unique. I could sense my ears widening when
Mm-hmm.
hearing his movies for the first time because of the music and because of the dialogue at the same time. Where are you at with Tarantino now? Do you have as excited a relationship to his movies, to what he does? Because he's a complicated figure, and I certainly don't want to adjudicate a lot of the personal history surrounding him, but I'm curious because he has evolved and he's a guy in his 50s now. He is the establishment in a lot of ways. So are you eagerly anticipating the new movie? Have you liked his films in the last 5 to 10 years?
I think for as much as I'm a little skeptical about how sincere it is, his stated cap on his output has affected how I look at his movies.
You're talking about 10 years. He said 10 movies.
10 movies. And I think that he might cheat and he'll do like a 12-hour miniseries, or he might just be like, well, backdoor, I'm allowed to do Star Trek, or I've just changed my mind in 2 years.
And he's already cheated.
But there's something about
Kill Bill 1 and 2, that's 2 movies. But he's calling it one movie.
There's something about that it makes me feel like every time he puts out a movie, it's a national holiday, that it's an event, and I don't feel that way about Martin Scorsese movies anymore. And that's one of the great filmmakers that's ever lived, and he still makes really good movies. But there's something about a Tarantino thing. And actually, you mentioned how complicated of a figure he is now, and it has been since 1992. I mean,
Always
you go back and watch Reservoir Dogs, you're like, whoa.
Yeah, why are we doing that?
This does not get made in 2019, and maybe for good reasons. And
a lot of charged racial language throughout all of his films, a lot of violence, a lot of sex.
And I guess one of the things that I kind of like about it is that, obviously he's pretty self-assured, and he's like, I get to make these movies because I'm an artist, and this is how my people talk. But I think it's interesting to have a filmmaker that makes us confront that stuff, and he's nothing if not confrontational.
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything Chris said. The thing that I love about, Tarantino, his entire career has been a performance, and I think that is very apt for a artist who is so metatextual. Like his career is a metatext. The 8th movie from Quentin Tarantino splashed across the screen. Who else? Why would you do that? Who else does that? So I think, there is. I'm eagerly anticipating, new studio, new circumstances. What does this mean? And especially, I watched Hateful Eight last night, rewatched it. He's at a really interesting place where I think he's not that his movies were not artistic before, but he really seems to be grasping for a deeper meaning in a more overt way than he has with Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown, which is an adaptation. That's a different story. But like Hateful Eight really seemed like, I'm trying to say something here. And that's interesting to me. I don't know if I ever perceived that Quentin Tarantino was trying to say something over the course of a movie before, maybe in scenes here and there, but not over the course of a movie like with Hateful Eight. So I'm eagerly anticipating to see where he goes.
That's very perceptive. I won't spoil anything about the new film. We'll talk about it later this week on the show, but I absolutely had that sensation when I walked out of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is, this is actually an effort to say something,
right,
as opposed to a lot of his other films, which are big top genre entertainments. And even when he's reimagining history in Inglorious Basterds, you still kind of feel like he made a really fun action movie. And maybe he's indicating something about that time or what we love and why we love it and what we use the things we love to destroy what we hate. But for the most part, it seems like it's most important for him to entertain you.
Yeah. It's like, this is how I feel watching Great Escape for the 60th time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I want you to feel that way. I want you to want to live in this world. It's telling that movie was his initial conception of it was like a 12-hour miniseries. Like he wanted to make it into like the most panoramic thing. And, you know, I think that I remember I was watching, when we were doing Inglorious Basterds rewatchables, I was watching a lot of interviews with him around that time. And he told Channel 4 in England something where he's like, you know, you can look at it as a fantasia or this expression of like revenge, like, you know, real historical vengeance. But to me, if my characters had been real, this would have happened. And I was like, that's nuts. Like, I can't, like, and he believes it. He believes that like his characters like could have changed the course of history. In some ways, like that's the thing I think is most complicated about him, is that this is a filmmaking ego that's not very common anymore. Yeah. You know, maybe unprecedented, but certainly it's uncommon to come across somebody who's like, I don't have to play by anybody's rules.
Right.
I love that. I think this is a segue into our top five. So one last thing I want to underline that I think is important is that self-belief that you're describing and the willingness to create a universe of his own. And we talk about expanded universes now in movies. We were just talking about the MCU. Quentin was putting Marvel comic books on the walls of characters in 1992. Yep. He had a lot of foresight about how that would be the future of the fanboy in some ways.
Yep.
On the other hand, he had a ton of foresight about imagining the interconnected relationship of characters in one movie that he wrote to another movie that he wrote. He thought generationally about how these characters fit together. Yeah. He created brands like cigarette brands and
Red Apple. Yeah.
He created radio stations. He would create full worlds. And some of them felt, you know, just basic textual things you'd encounter in your life, but that created even more excitement.
It's a childlike imagination.
Yeah.
Often what we think about when we talk about that stuff is like, is the comic book stuff, but that's when you're a kid and you're sitting around with like a pack of baseball cards and then you like lay them out in the diamond and you're like, this is my new team.
Yeah.
And like, I'm starting to imagine them getting traded for one another or talking to each other. And then all of a sudden you're sitting in front of 9 pieces of cardboard for 2 hours talking to yourself. That's Quentin Tarantino.
He relishes that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the slow-mo walk in Res Dogs and then the slow-mo walk of the Crazy Eights in Kill Bill 1. He loves, here's my team, set them up, and let's watch them and enter the arena.
People, like all the actors who've worked with him before, like Diane Kruger was like, he showed me 25 movies. He had an entire biography of Bridget von Hammersmark.
Right.
I was almost overwhelmed, and then I could like pick and choose from what he gave me, but there was no question you could possibly have about your character that he couldn't A, answer, and B, be like, and if you want to know exactly what I'm talking about, watch this 1953 German movie where Marlene Dietrich turns to her left.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about.
And we could do an entire top 5 podcast about his unproduced work too, because there's so many movie story ideas. You know, I have always wanted to see the Vega brothers, Vince and Vic, team up to
Killer of Crows.
Rob Banks for Killer of Crows, which is an African-American World War II story. There were so many things that were rumored around him that absorbing all of the ephemera. I had never seen books written so fast about a filmmaker so shortly after his career began.
Yeah.
And that was part of what got me so excited about him, is being 12, 13 years old and having 2 or 3 entire books to read just about the person. And it's amazing that he's been able to essentially keep this going. He's had ebbs and flows. He's had down periods. I think particularly that period after Death Proof, before Inglorious Basterds, there was a lot of conversation about, is Quentin cooked? But he's largely stayed consistently relevant and present through going on 28 years now, and it's kind of an amazing thing. Should we dive into our top fives?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Chris, why don't you start us off with number 5?
So we should probably say at the top that we are including whatever Quentin Tarantino has sort of touched in a significant way as a screenwriter or as whatever. So my number 5 movie is True Romance.
Wow.
And
This is my number 4.
we've talked about this. I think we did a rewatchables about
certainly
True
did.
Romance, so I won't belabor it. It's the most deeply romantic thing he's ever written. It's probably on like just a flat out like filmmaking level, the flashiest, best made thing. You know, Tony Scott is technically, I think, a better filmmaker than Quentin Tarantino. The merging of the two, you get this neon dream that's just like these two lovers on the run, Bonnie and Clyde, with this amazing gallery of characters surrounding them: Gandolfini, Walken, Dennis Hopper, Sizemore and Penn, and all these different people, Rappaport, Bronson Pinchot, and of course Brad Pitt as Floyd. It's probably one of my like favorite ensemble movies in that way. And I just thought it might be an interesting conversation just briefly as we get into the list of like this sliding doors moment of what if Quentin Tarantino had been more of a player? Like what if he hadn't kind of walled himself off and been like, I make a film by Quentin Tarantino every 3.5 years or whatever it is. There's people who are in the movies and then they go out of the movies. But this idea of Tarantino as the guy who wrote True Romance and Tony Scott directed it and then did some rewrite work on Crimson Tide. And what would have happened if some of his other movies had been directed by other people, like Catherine Bigelow's Kill Bill is kind of amazing to think about. It would have been a very interesting last 25 years if Tarantino had been like producing more people or writing more stuff or doing rewrites on different stuff, or doing more work like he did on ER and CSI, where he just like drops in and makes a couple episodes of something. Kind of like a fascinating counterfactual, but yeah, True Romance is my number 5.
I'm glad we got the version of his career that we got, that he was in control of because of that self-belief. But that is a fun parlor game. I'm trying to think of, because some of his movies are indelibly his own.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kill Bill, I actually
Especially
have a
the
hard
later
time
stuff.
imagining like somebody else doing, because it's such a genre mishmash. But something like The Hateful Eight, you could see any great kind of mystery filmmaker sliding their feet into.
It would have been fascinating to see somebody else direct Jackie Brown, which I mean, I think is in some ways a lot of people feel like it's his warmest movie and his most human movie, but I would be curious to know what would have happened if somebody else had directed that too.
Nora Ephron's Jackie Brown?
Yeah. Yeah, James L. Brooks.
Yeah, I'm True Romance is my number 4. I was thinking about it a little bit in terms of the chronology of consumption, and I definitely saw this before I saw Reservoir Dogs because this was easier to find. This was a big studio release. It was probably much more prominently displayed in Blockbuster when I saw it. It had movie stars, and it's a little bit like that first sip of Zima. You know, it's like, this isn't what I'm going to be consuming for the rest of my life, but this is the entryway through the door of bourbon. You know, like that. It gets you situated, because very similarly to what Jason was describing about hearing that Madonna conversation, hearing Clarence talk about Sonny Chiba movies in True Romance was mind blowing. Yeah, I for a long period of time thought Sonny Chiba was an invention of Quentin Tarantino's. I did not realize that he was referencing something real, and that is such a powerful thing to learn, that somebody has access to all of these things you've never heard of, and then also can create this whole world that is fake, and then trying to figure out what goes where and why. Put it on top of, like, put a 12-year-old in front of a Tony Scott movie and they will be taken away. Yeah. You know, Tony Scott, the stylist of all stylists, one of the slickest filmmakers of all time, getting a chance to do crazy shoot 'em ups in a Hollywood producer's hotel room.
With that dialogue.
With all that dialogue. Just really a genuinely fun movie, and a great, like, a living example of a filmmaker selling reputation off of the flashiest script he can write. So as personal as that story is for him, you can tell that he's really trying to impress people with like Drexel Spivey and things like that. Number 5, Jason.
I picked all movies that were just directed by Tarantino. I had a hard time getting True
Romance been in your top 5?
Yes, it would have been. But philosophically, I had a hard time getting in there. I'm going with Kill Bill 1.
That is 5. Also my number 5.
I think that it's the most uneven movies of the movies on my top 5, but it's also, you just feel like here is Quentin Tarantino having the best time possible. the fight scene with the crazy 88s is so over the top, and it does things that you just do not expect, like the switch to black and white, the switch to the where they're all in the blue lighting. It's like, what is happening? Why is this happening? The absolute over the topness of it, where it's like that all of a sudden morphs into comedy, where you just see a dozen people with violent amputations crawling towards the floor and towards the door and groaning, almost cartoonish in the violence, but so incredibly shot and just visceral and vibrant in a way that is you can't imagine anyone else doing it.
One of the most fun experiences I've ever had in a movie theater. This movie in particular.
And,
I was the right age,
yes.
and it a long time had passed between Tarantino projects.
Quite a while.
He made us wait.
Yeah.
Jackie Brown is 97,
Yeah.
and Jackie Brown, which is a brilliant film, is very low toned. It's very calm. It's very
adult.
It's leisurely, and Kill Bill is Volume 1 in particular is the opposite of that.
And I felt like Jackie Brown was so character driven and was such a character study, and what happens in Jackie Brown is actually like so besides the point. Like there's like some smuggling and some money changing hands and some double crossing. Kill Bill is all archetypes. It's like Bill, B, L. There's very flat. It's super physical. It's the most action movie of any movie he's made. I think that there's a lot of long dialogue scenes, but for the most part, there's like a set piece every 10 minutes or 12 minutes or so and across two movies. So in a weird way, well, like the two Kill Bill movies wind up like kind of outliers to me in the rest of his filmography. I've always respected them more than I've enjoyed them.
Returning to Volume 1 in particular, Volume 2 puts a cap on it, and it feels actually a little bit more like a Tarantino movie to me, because it's much more story driven. It's much more about the relationships. Volume 1 does a couple of things that I think he does better than anybody. One, he just shows you things at the beginning of the movie that you would think would be the big reveal for the end of the movie. At the beginning of the movie, you see Oren Ishii's name crossed out right after she kills Vernita Green, and you're like, so now we're going to spend an hour watching her pursue Oren, and she's just going to kill her at the end, and we know because she already crossed her name out, but it doesn't matter.
It
doesn't make the movie any less fun to watch. And that's such an incredible sleight of hand by a director to be that confident in the style and the look and the excitement around his movie, that the end point of this 2-hour kung fu extravaganza doesn't matter as much as watching that crazy fight that you're talking about. The confidence is so exciting. And also the confidence to just say, I'm going to put an 8-minute anime short in the middle of this movie.
Yeah.
That was so ballsy.
And just being like, I'm going to make Uma Thurman a martial arts star.
Even the special
that was not like what people thought Uma Thurman was going to do in the 90s.
We think about Tarantino obviously for his dialogue and his writing, but this movie felt timeless in the way that like watching Buster Keaton feels timeless, because it's like the violence is so over the top that it really becomes cartoonish and antic in a really interesting way. Even those scenes of like the plane coming in over the skyline are done in a way that's like meant to heighten the unreality of what you're seeing. And it's just a really interesting movie from him.
Yeah, I love it. Chris, number 4 for you.
Django.
Ooh.
So this is my least favorite, I think, of his movies. So I'm curious to hear what you like about it.
I almost picked it because of that.
Okay.
I think it's the darkest movie he's ever made. It's the most uncomfortable I've ever been watching a Quentin Tarantino movie. I think part of it is that it actually does feel like a Sergio Leone Western to me. Those movies are not like fun. The highs are high, and like there's like really cool like meme-worthy moments in those movies, but they're actually grueling slogs of vengeance, and vengeance is not like a fun thing. You're obviously driven by trauma, and this is trauma on a like generation upon generation upon generation of racial trauma that's going on in this movie. Whether Quentin Tarantino had the right to make this or handled it as sensitively as he should have, I think is a really interesting conversation to have. I think the reason why ultimately this movie is here is because I think DiCaprio as Calvin is his greatest creation.
Yeah.
It is the greatest monster he's ever written. And there's a real seductive thing with these Tarantino characters, even Landa, who's equally a monster in Basterds. is the dialogue is so rich and the drama is so rich that you can't help but just be like almost attracted to the character, even if you're repulsed by their behavior. I don't feel that way with Calvin. Calvin is like DiCaprio actually pushes past that. And there's a lot of great actors who have done a lot of great roles in Quentin Tarantino parts, but I think that like 20 years from now, we're going to look back on DiCaprio's performance in Django and just be like, that's like one of the most chilling screen villains we've ever had.
Yeah, that scene where he slams his hand on the table
the phrenology scene.
Is so repulsive and also magnetic in just the way the places he goes to inhabit that character are truly chilling and revolting.
I was watching that scene when he's like gripping Kerry Washington's head, and you're just like, I can't believe this is happening.
Yeah.
And that this was a blockbuster.
But this is something amazing that he does throughout his career is he identifies actors we have a relationship to,
right?
Even if we've forgotten what that relationship is, and he manipulates us with that.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Travolta in Pulp Fiction. We think he's this kind of person and we see him do this kind of thing and we're blown away. He dances. This is John Travolta we love. But also he does this over here. He's a monster. And he has this innate sense of stardom and the expectations of stardom, and he works with it so well. Similarly in the new film, I'll be curious to hear what you guys say about Leonardo DiCaprio in the new film, because it's a lot of playing with expectation in the same way. What else about Django? Because my problem with Django ultimately is I think it's a pretty bad ending. And,
the shootout.
Yeah, and I think relative to the Inglorious Basterds ending, which is a similar explosively orchestrated big time set piece, this one just kind of felt like overkill, literally.
Yeah.
And it always leaves me with a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth.
I think that's a really valid criticism. I think in some ways I'm still unpacking how I feel about Django, and so many of these movies I'm like, this is my thing about Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs. So it almost my inability to articulate my own feelings about the movie led me to putting it here. The ending is not great. I do think that it's a fantasy, and it is sort of like, what if you could go back and do this?
Yeah.
What like there would be no overkill, there would be no limit to your bloodthirst kind of. To me, the movie really ends in the last parlor scene with Jackson, Waltz, DiCaprio, and Fox, and that last sort of bit of exchange, and I couldn't resist and all that stuff.
Would it surprise you guys to know that this is his most successful movie by far at the box office?
Not really.
It would slightly surprise me, yes.
It's going to be weird in 10 years when there's a Rick Ross song in the middle of this movie. I need to cite that. Jason, what's your number 4?
My number 4 is Inglorious Basterds.
Love this film. This is my number 3.
It's my number 2.
I just think there are a lot of things in Quentin Tarantino movies that have not aged well, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But I think one thing that's aged really well is the idea that Nazis should be treated with no mercy.
Yeah.
I really appreciated that from this movie. This
I
idea,
thought about it that way.
This idea of it's obviously a kind of a wish fulfillment rage fantasy.
It is a political action, though.
An overtly political action that I found really satisfying on rewatch. All the dialogue's great, all that stuff is great, but I'm so happy that he put in that end scene of just like two guys submachine gunning Hitler for 3 minutes, like just clip it another new clip. In
the style of Scarface.
New clip. Because that is a really incredible, it's just like a really trenchant statement and feeling to be like, you know what? No mercy, no quarter for these dudes. Like, let's not forget what it was all about. Let's not negotiate with them. Let's just here in this space where we can imagine a world in which we would be allowed to do this. Let's just see what would happen if we just wiped them out.
And that's in keeping with a lot of the creative choices he makes throughout his career, which is same as crossing off Oren's name before you see her, same as switching the radio station in the middle of the title sequence. It's like, I literally am setting fire to the playbook because I can, because no one says no. And that's such a weirdly empowering thing that very few people abide by. It feels like a lot of people try to get into the business of filmmaking or writing or anything that is a creative art, and they know because of the boundaries that have been drawn around other people that they have to exist inside of those boundaries. I've always admired his willingness to say, fuck that. I don't need to worry about that.
And then on a more micro level, like the scene in the basement bar is a masterpiece.
Yes, that's your thing.
Yeah.
And is, Quentin is so associated with kind of Mexican standoff structure, and that's his greatest one ever.
Three guns, two sets of balls, three guys staring at each other. Like, yeah.
And each round of dialogue only heightens the suspense. Even when they're not talking about the thing, they're talking around the thing. The sense of danger is immense. Just an unbelievable scene to hang that movie around.
Chris, you and I talked about this movie a lot on the rewatchables as well. Was there one thing? What was the one thing that you were like, shit, I forgot to say this about this movie? I feel like anytime we all do a podcast,
super long podcast, so I can't imagine there's anything. I would just distill it down to there's a golf term called on plane. It's like when you swing on planes.
Incredible, huge flex.
I just mean like
flex.
This movie is on plane. Like everything it does is in harmony with itself. There's a lot of movies. Rick Ross showing up in Django is probably going to be. We sure we needed that? We sure that works out?
Little hitch in his swing there.
There is no hitch in this movie. There's everything basically feels of a piece.
Yeah.
The fact that he writes only 30% of the movies in English, like that's
unbelievable.
That is amazing. That we like $200 million worth of people were like, yeah, I want to watch a movie in German.
That is incredible.
With a bunch of people I've never seen before, like Diane Kruger or Michael Fassbender or Christoph Waltz at the time. Like nobody was like, can you imagine like if you showed somebody that movie and you were like, you didn't tell them anything about it and you showed them the first scene, they'd be like, I don't know it. Who are these people?
Right.
Like I met La Petite and Christoph Waltz and nobody knew who Léa Seydoux was. Nobody knew who Melanie Laurent was. They were like, how is this going to be a box office smash?
I mean, he's done that time and again.
Yeah.
Just shown us new people or people who are operating on the fringes of culture. If you look at actors like Michael Parks and Michael Bowen and this wide range of actors, he made a star out of Michael Madsen, essentially, a guy who really just has not had a huge profile, all respect to the movie Species.
Sorry, I'm not Bill. You don't have to worry about it.
And he has this innate ability to not just do what I was saying earlier, which is manipulate our expectations around stars, but to create new stars.
So where are we? So I've gone True Romance, Django. You went, what's your 5-4?
Kill Bill, Inglorious.
I've got Kill Bill Volume 1 at 5, True Romance at 4. Your number 3.
My number 3 is Reservoir Dogs.
So this didn't make my list. And
you madman.
You need a head check, my guy.
It might just be because it's the one I've seen
Sure.
that's the furthest away from my rewatch.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I rewatched everything. And Reservoir Dogs came first because we did a podcast about it.
Yeah.
Now, I think you could probably choose any day of the week and I'd have a different top 5.
Sure.
And I love Reservoir Dogs, but what is it that puts it so close to the top 3?
I mean, so much of what Jason said in the beginning about the learning to love dialogue as much as you love the visuals. And I think also for me, it's the performances, which were had a certain tone at the time. And even now, I feel like you don't see a lot of actors who are willing to make themselves that ugly at so little reward. A lot of the times when actors do things that are kind of grotesque, they're kind of like almost expecting either a character redemption or some sort of statue at the end of the run where it's like, yeah, see, I had this weird eye twitch the entire movie. I should be an Oscar nominee. And it's like, nobody in this movie comes out looking good.
Right.
They're covered in blood. They're screaming racial epithets. They're basically disgusting pieces of shit.
Yes.
And I kind of admire the movie for that. I kind of admire the movie for being like, you can make a really interesting movie about really bad people, and not have it be anything more than that or anything less than that. I think I still really respect this movie for that.
Yeah, it's my number 2. I just think the accessibility of it, watching it this weekend, rewatching it this weekend, I was struck by how much of this movie, you could probably do 80% of this movie with your phone if you wanted to. And it really shows you what a talent he actually is. Because you could, the tools are available. You can make that movie today.
He probably was sitting around and he's like, if I can't make this movie, I'll probably do it as play.
Yeah, there's one set. It's like Our Town.
Yeah.
There's one set. There's no props except guns.
Yeah.
And it's just guys sitting around in 2 rooms, essentially. And it's just so pared down and necessary to me in terms of understanding like what it is that Tarantino does. And it's, obviously all the kind of elements of the style are there. I love it. I find it eminently rewatchable.
So we're doing this podcast miniseries with Amy Nicholson where she interviewed Quentin. And in her research, she came upon something I'd never seen before, which is a video on YouTube of a rehearsal from the Sundance Labs of sequences from Reservoir Dogs. Wow. I don't know if you guys have seen this before. And it's the majority of the sequencing is Quentin portraying Mr. White and Buscemi as Mr. Pink. And it's those early scenes in sort of the first act when they're kind of back and forth when they both arrive back at the warehouse. And, it's shot on handheld and it's kind of moving around pretty quickly. And the staging is obviously not as elegant or clean or blocked as well as the film is. But you can see, even just in these rehearsals,
in his head.
He knows it all. He sees exactly where this movie's going. And he is acting pitch perfect. He's not Harvey Keitel. He's never going to be Harvey Keitel. He does not have the same movie star charisma.
The cadences and all that stuff, I'm sure.
The beats are there. The hand motions are there. The intonations are there. It's kind of amazing how a year before he made this movie, it was right there in his head.
Yeah.
And it's clear that he was born for this. And that is a cliche unto itself, but it is literally true for him. So I'm down with Reservoir Dogs, even though it isn't in my top 5.
One more thing about this movie, Quentin is not known for tender scenes, but the scene when, Keitel cradles Tim Roth as he's crying like, I'm going to die. I can't believe this is going to happen to me.
I'm going to die.
Is like back at the warehouse is one of, that's one of the most tender things that he's ever shot and absolutely necessary for the brutal reveal, which comes forthwith.
I also like Keitel's very specific scientific knowledge of why it's okay to be shot in the gut.
Yeah.
Other than the kneecap, it's the most painful place to be shot.
I'm sorry. Are you a doctor?
Answer me. Are you a doctor? Okay then. I think we've established that you're not a doctor. So
Mr. White strikes me as the kind of guy who really consumed a lot of Reader's Digest.
Yeah.
He had a lot of stray info,
Yeah.
About waitressing, all those data points, really impressive stuff. So my number 3 was Inglorious Basterds. Chris, your number 2.
My number 2 is Inglorious Basterds. So
Jason, what's your number 2?
what's your 3?
My 3 is Pulp Fiction.
Your 3 is Pulp. Okay.
For all the reasons that we've all mentioned before. Yeah. It drops to me. I dropped it to 3. I had it to 2, but I dropped it because, listen, I think the weakness of Tarantino is when he puts himself in the movies. And here's a scene that you really don't need. Every character,
The Bonnie situation
in the year of our Lord 2019 is extremely tough, and every character in this like incredible dollhouse of like rapscallion characters kind of has a thing that you understand, and like I don't
why
understand
Jimmy's in this movie.
I don't understand what Jimmy's thing is. Like, I don't understand anything about Jimmy except that he exists to drop like a B-52's, load of N-bombs on a city.
I think you need that scene because you need to get the wolf into the movie.
Right. Yeah.
But I wonder if you could go back if that's the one sequence that Quentin would edit. I don't know.
He obviously thought it was fucking hilarious and amazing because he was like, I'm Jimmy.
I am, watch this.
Yes. Let's save the rest of the Pulp Fiction
Sure.
conversation because I suspect it's going to appear later in our
Right.
lists. My number
That's my 3.
My number 3 was Inglorious. I mentioned that already.
Yeah.
Your number 2 you've already named.
Is Inglorious, yeah.
And your number 2 you've already named. Reservoir Dogs. My number 2 is Jackie Brown.
Okay. I'm glad we got to this.
Now, I think that the case for it has become a cliche as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is that this is the mature film. It was dinged at the time of release. People didn't really get it. They thought it was too slow. They thought it was too linear. They thought it was too sort of like obvious and dull from the guy who made Pulp Fiction. And then as it aged as we aged with Quentin, it seemed more mature. It seemed like an evocation of a time in life that we're all kind of getting closer to.
Mhm.
It's interesting to me that, Jackie, when I saw this movie, her character, they noticed 44 years old. And I was like, she might as well be dead. And now it's like getting near to 44. I'm like, some relatable shit going on with Jackie about what happens when you're on the other side. You know, what's your worth as you head into middle age? And even though all of the kind of cliche life cycle of the mature third film from Quentin Tarantino is true, I still responded to it in an authentic way.
Oh yeah,
And
I mean
it's still beautiful.
The one thing that I think, there's a couple of things that date this movie, namely Samuel L. Jackson's like sort of hair and outfits.
A lot of great Sam choices in this movie.
But the part where he comes over and turns her halogen lamp off. First of all, the fact that she has a halogen lamp, a floor lamp that dims. And he comes and he turns it off, and then she's like, he's got his hands around her throat, and she pulls the gun on him. What she eventually negotiates for herself is $100,000 if she goes to jail. And it's like, this is a movie about someone trying to eke out $100,000. You know what I mean? It's not major stakes. It's small time crooks. I don't even think that like the gangsters in this movie are like crime lords. They're like,
he's trying to get $500,000 out of Mexico. $500,000, and he's like, and then I'm good. I'm gonna see the world on that.
And
he's a condo gangster. You know, he's a beachside mediocre gangster.
And then, but when you watch even like Den of Thieves, and they're like, we're gonna steal $21 million today, and you're just like, what? Do what with it? Like, start like a PayPal competitor? Like, I don't even understand what like some of the stakes are in this. And that's kind of gotten lost in crime movies. Like there's a lot of crime movies where they're trying to steal like a couple $100 from a horse, like a horse race or something.
But once again, and we have talked about this recently, it's not about the stakes of the heist. You know, I think the stakes of the heist in some ways get really meaningful in his later films. They get really meaningful in Inglorious Basterds. They get really meaningful in Django and in Hateful Eight. In this movie, it's just character.
It's
just character.
There's something. This movie's about like losers, honestly. Like in a very lovable way. But these are people with like shabby apartments.
Even Max Cherry, is like not a big time guy.
It's about people you ignore. Like you just don't really think
and
about the stewardess you had on the plane.
About them. Yes. Then Jackie Brown's not on my list, and I think Jackie Brown's not on my list because I couldn't not put these other movies on the list. But if that's his Wednesday night, like 7 innings, giving up 1 earned run, like that's fucking incredible.
I know. It's impressive though that to make a whole movie, and we should say it's based on Rum Punch, one of the great Elmore Leonard books. Also a kind of, I read that book at a very similar time in my life as when I discovered his movies. And that is very similarly unlocked a lot in my brain about the way that characters can talk to each other.
Dude, I remember reading before Elmore Leonard and I was like, this is a slog.
Yeah.
I don't plan on doing this for much longer.
Totally.
Like when they don't make me read anymore, I'll stop. And then you read Elmore Leonard and you just feel like that.
Yeah. There's like
page.
There's a rhythm.
Yeah. Rat-a-tat.
Jackie Brown is my number 1.
Yeah. Jason.
Flex. Love it.
Lord.
I love it.
You're on the herd.
Like
let's
for
go.
all the reasons.
I jumped ahead of you. I'm sorry.
It's okay. For all the reasons Sean said, like that there is, the scene with Jackie and Max after she's taken the gun, he comes back to get it. And they're sitting around her kitchen table just talking about getting old. This is territory that Tarantino has never tread before. And it's really tender and affecting. There's that moment where, the bag switch is happening. And Jackie looks into the camera for a second. And it's just like, everything's just right there. As you said, it's all character. It's like the stakes for her for $100,000 little heist are basically her entire life. Like this is it. It's all on the line. She's working at the worst airline. She's potentially got multiple felonies hanging on her, not to mention somebody looking to kill her. She's hanging on by a thread, and it's all about making this one very small heist come off. And then there's, De Niro playing with his own image in a way that is
he's so brilliant,
genius level. He
God.
does so much with little grunts, and little just head nods that is just man, this guy that's why he's so good.
Yeah.
He's incredible.
I think Bridget Fonda may be in top 10 Tarantino performances in this movie.
Louis, the way she hisses it, in the
entire sequence from Lewis and Melanie walking out of the shopping mall through the parking lot, and then afterwards when Sam Jackson picks up De Niro and they're in the car together and he explains that he has killed Melanie is some of the dead funniest shit I've ever seen in a movie in my life.
Most hilarious freaking shit ever.
So such a great odd film, and this is the kind of film you would expect him to be making now.
Yeah.
When he's got a lot of confidence. It's bizarre to go back and imagine him being 33 years old and making this movie.
That's the other thing that really, why it's number one for me, is because it's not like he was being restrained by forces or whatever. He was just understood what the right choices would be to make this a great movie, and that's what he did. He could have put all its flourishes in there and it would have been, and people would have been like, oh my, there it is, the Tarantino touch. But he didn't do that.
Yeah, and he could have cast Halle Berry as Jackie, and he could have cast De Niro as Max Cherry, and he didn't do that. And in some ways, that was kind of willful obscurantism. And in some ways, it was completely brilliant because I think both of those actors
he was just like,
so good.
That's not what a bail bondsman would look like.
Exactly.
And then Michael Keaton as Ray Nicolette for the second time that decade is one of the strangest movie footnotes ever.
If you haven't seen Jackie Brown, you have to go out and watch it immediately because it is fucking wonderful. It's 2.5 hours of pure character. Chris, I suspect you and I have the same number one.
Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, it's Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction's the best movie? Is it the best movie?
Is it underrated at this point?
While I acknowledge Jason's criticism of the Jimmy scene, which has probably been rubbing me the wrong way for about 25 years.
Yeah. It wasn't like, I don't think even at the time, nobody was like, man, that's cool.
Good choice.
This is awesome. It just so happens to be wedged in one of like the singularly great scenes in movie history, which is from when they blow the guy's brains out to when the wolf arrives. And he's like, scoop up all the little pieces of brain and skull. Gotta get in there.
I mean, that head explosion scene, I remember, I think I was watching it with a friend who'd seen it and was like, wait, no, just don't. Because I started to talk to him about something. He's like, no, just hold on. You gotta, in other words, you gotta see this head explode.
Yeah. I mean, I talked about this briefly at the beginning of the pod. This is what I was talking about, where it felt like his life experiences merging with being part of like a underworld crime fiction tradition of ne'er-do-wells and hitmen and sex freaks and gangsters and boxers. And it was essentially like an anthology that they tied these guys together. They tied all these characters together. And rewatching it, there are scenes that are iconic, like "Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon," the dance scene, that, you just basically thought about for about 15 months after the movie came out. And that soundtrack was huge. That Urge Overkill song, with version of the Neil Diamond song, was just on the radio all the time. It was like a blockbuster album of a movie.
Yeah, the amount of catchphrases that came out of it.
And all the catchphresses. And then, Sean,
Yes, you did, Brett!
Yeah. I
get medieval on your ass.
I forget the Bible reading.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I forget parts of this movie. Yeah. And, you mentioned this, where the way he plays with our relationship to characters and our relationship to movie stars, the Vincent Vega character and the Uma Thurman character, the way in which she shows up with Marcellus later, or he gets shot coming out of the bathroom, and it's like there's such kind of like not expected endings to like the where they're supposed to be, was so challenging and interesting to wrap your head around as a kid. I keep thinking as I'm talking, like, I got to mention the Watch speech. I got to mention this thing. Is there a movie where every moment is somehow worthy of dissection and discussion?
I think it has the most rewatchable scenes of any movie ever made. But in addition to that, when I was rewatching it, the things that I picked up on again last night, paying very close attention to it, were things that I probably wasn't mature enough to understand when I first saw it. In particular, and I remember adult critics citing a lot of this stuff and me feeling like this isn't what's cool about this movie, but there is an incredible sexiness between John Travolta and Uma Thurman in this movie that feels like a corny thing to say until you get older and you realize like what real chemistry and tension is.
How absent that is from most movies this day.
100%. There's so little focus on that. And it just zeroes in. Or similarly, when Vincent Vega and Butch encounter one another at Marcellus's bar, and the look that they give after
that antipathy,
Palooka, that whole thing, and the intensity and the camera holding on Willis's face for the entire moment until he exits that bar in the middle of the day is just incredible stuff. It's very patient, you know, it's very precise. Like he's not just the guy who does, and I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance.
Yeah.
He can do that. He can write the crazy speech. He can do a big shootout. He can make you excited by an action sequence or a car chase. But the little intimate moments are extraordinarily precise.
Yeah, and it's like, it almost feels more like a story someone's telling you at a party rather than a movie you're watching, because the way in which, you know, and then Bruce Willis is this guy, he's walking out, he's gonna leave him behind, but then he thinks, and then he walks back in, and then he sees the bat, and he puts the bat down, and then he picks this, you know, and it's like all this stuff, even the OD scene, which is, I remember when I saw that, I had never I don't think I knew what heroin really was when I saw this movie, you know?
I couldn't understand it when I first saw it, like what the problem was.
But even like the breaking down of like, that's the Acapulco Gold, and this is, you know, like all that stuff.
That was crime novel shit.
Yeah.
That was like,
but I didn't know, like, and then you, like, I think I knew people could overdose from drugs. I didn't know you could bring them back.
Yeah.
You know? And that whole sequence where you're just like, and now this person who I've just been like, quite candidly, like lusting after this entire movie has barfed in their own hair and died and come back to life and is actually not going to be with this guy. I still try to wrap my mind around what happens in Pulp Fiction, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, the thing that struck me on rewatch is just like Quentin has a master author's understanding of how perspective works and how to make, you know, when I first saw it, I didn't really grasp the kind of like puzzle box chronology stuff he was doing, because each little vignette is so grounded on the characters that it's depicting in that moment. Like when Jules and Vincent are walking in to do the hit at the beginning of the movie, there's all these little moments where they walk away from the camera and you're watching them and you're like waiting in front of the elevator while they go off and have this conversation for them to come back. So you're understanding the whole time of, we're going to do this thing. Now we've gone on this little side path and I'm watching that happen, waiting for them to come back. He does all these things, all these little tricks with perspective that ground each scene in such a way that I didn't even notice that it was all, that the chronography was all jumbled up.
Yeah.
And I just think that is really masterful shit to really understand how to depict from a character's perspective what is happening.
Yeah, and it makes certain things more rewarding too, because we know about the showdown between Vincent and Butch, and then we see the execution accidentally in the bathroom later on in the movie, but that's not a purposeful thing because they have animosity. It's just by dint of storytelling that is misarranged purposefully. And I think I could see how some people at the time would think that was kind of a gimmick, you know, that sort of fracturing. One of the movies we talked to him about on this series that we're doing is Point Blank, which is a similar kind of execution, this John Borman 1967 movie, which kind of shatters our perception of what's real and what's not real, and things don't happen in real time. And, you know, he was a pretty young, he's like in his late 20s and he's doing this, and he's got a real, like you said, a master author's grip on when to show us whose ideas we're seeing.
Yeah. Did he rip the, there's a scene in Point Blank where I forget the main character's name, but he's walking through LAX, kind of marching through LAX with the tile going by. Did he take that Jackie Brown kind of sliding scene from that?
That's more of an homage to The Graduate, which is shot for shot in the LAX when you see, I think you see Benjamin Braddock kind of moving on the escalator fast, but there's also a very similar shot in Point Blank, you're right. And that's the other thing that we've hardly even talked about, which is that all of these movies are laden with homage, and they're all these little puzzle boxes into other movies that you can explore.
Maybe that's why Pulp sometimes stands alone for me, is because I just don't feel like Lance comes from another movie. I don't.
Do you think this is Roger Avery's influence? Because this
I think it was their life. I don't know that these guys were partying like that or anything like. But
there's a lot of real seeming people.
Yeah. Yes, and there's just like a lot of like, oh, like that's the car that Butch drives. Absolutely, you know, like that's the turtleneck that Marcellus would wear. You know, like there's some of this stuff just feels like, hey, if we never get to make another movie, let's put everything in this one. Even though I'm sure he knew he was going to have a long career, it sounds like he always had a lot of confidence about that, and he had Natural Born Killers and True Romance going at the time. This feels like the document dump, you know. And if we never get another one, let's put it like this.
Who's your favorite Pulp character?
Ooh,
Probably Mia.
What about you, Jason?
Probably Butch.
I like that choice.
Who's yours? Peter Green? Peter Green's character?
Definitely not. I don't know the answer to my own question. I think Vincent Vega is a pretty
we fucking up by not just saying
compelling
Jules?
figure.
Jules.
Yeah, it's got to be Jules. I don't really understand Jules's internal life, but I like watching him talk.
Yeah.
Which is something you can say about almost every Tarantino character. Okay, let's wrap this up by giving me one bonus Tarantino thing that you love. This can be a movie he's written, a snatch of dialogue he put in another movie. It can be a performance he's given, maybe. You know, this is a guy who hosted Saturday Night Live. You know what I mean? He's done it all. He, as you said, he made an episode of ER. He made 2 episodes of CSI.
I will say this is not aged well, but I will say his performance in Sleep With Me.
The
Explain that.
famous
So
Top
this
Gun
is
monologue.
a really, really small, random 90s indie movie. I'm having a hard time remembering. Is it Craig Sheffer is in this movie?
He's the lead. Yeah, I think he's the lead.
And who's the woman in it? Is it like Olivia Dabo or something? Like who's in Sleep With Me? I can't even remember. I remember Bodies Rest in Motion with Tim Roth and Bridget Fonda, which is like the kind of like the same thing.
Meg Tilly.
Craig Sheffer, and who's the other guy?
Stoltz.
Okay. And it's just like set in LA, and it's basically a love triangle movie, a really talky love triangle movie, which was not uncommon in the early 90s. Shout out to the early 90s. And there's a party scene. And in this party scene, Quentin Tarantino shows up as like a party guest and goes up to Todd Field, who would later make In the Bedroom and Little Children.
You may know him as Nick Nightingale, the piano player from Eyes Wide Shut. Fidelio.
And Tarantino goes up to Todd Field and is like, basically has like a 3-minute monologue about what Top Gun is about. And it's about a man's battle with his own homosexuality. And it's just stunning. It is like, it's first of all, you cannot believe they just were like, let's stop this movie for a few minutes so Quentin Tarantino can do a speech about Top Gun.
Also, like, I remember reading about this, like in Rolling Stone or Spin or whatever at the time. And, you know, pre-YouTube, it's like, well, how the F do I watch? Like, I don't even know how to find this movie.
And he's like, an Iceman and his group, they're like, come here, go the gay way, be on the gay side. And it's like all about like these guys getting like, and when you actually watch Top Gun, it's a pretty compelling argument. But it captures his ability to communicate and his ability to basically make what he finds important and interesting to anyone.
I am going to go with his kind of infamous turn as one of like 5 or 6 Elvis impersonators on Golden Girls.
Oh yeah,
nice.
Before he had made it, when he was a struggling actor. It's a great lesson to all of us out there. You know, just stick with it. Stick with it.
Keep plugging away.
Keep plugging away.
To that end, Quentin has always been a tortured actor forced to make his own brilliant movies because no one else will cast him in those movies. He did convince his buddy Robert Rodriguez to cast him in From Dusk Till Dawn, which is a movie that I think does not have really like a long-term shelf life for most people. That now there was a series, and there's been a series of From Dusk Till Dawn movies recently, and there was a TV show on El Rey. But I don't think that it has gotten quite the expanded universe treatment that it deserves. And also, what those movies and this series are missing are the Gecko brothers. Now, the Gecko brothers are portrayed by Quentin, who plays Richie Gecko, and by George...
Who's a sex criminal.
Who's a sex criminal. Well, I'm getting to that. And George Clooney, who plays Seth Gecko. Yeah. So Quentin Tarantino and George Clooney are blood
Written
brothers.
by Tarantino. So he was like,
Who can we get? Let's get Clooney, hot off of ER.
Yes.
And
with the Caesar still.
Yes, this is a movie about 2 men who have robbed a bank, taken a hostage.
Several hostages.
Well, they take one hostage and then they meet a family in a camper and then they take several hostages. They go to a border town strip club.
Yeah.
And they find overnight that this strip club is a den of vampires. Mm-hmm. Now,
they just don't make them like this anymore.
This movie
do not
is fucking wild.
It's fucking wild.
It is really weird.
It has multiple sex crimes.
It is.
Then the vampires come.
Yes.
Star turned by Selma Hayek also?
Yes.
Incredible Hayek.
Truly great Hayek seductress / vampire lizard ghoul. This movie is insane.
Yeah.
However,
Harvey Keitel, Juliette Lewis. I can't remember who the teenage son is.
Ernest Liu, who did not do a lot of work, Cheech Marine, and Danny Trejo,
Yeah.
our friend Danny Trejo, and Tom Savini,
Our friend Danny Trejo.
and Fred Williamson, and Michael Parks, and all these great kind of B-movie figures that he and Rodriguez are obsessed with. I'm citing all of this to say, Quentin Tarantino purposefully not just cast himself as the brother of George Clooney, but purposefully made himself a lewd sex criminal who becomes a vampire.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's self-knowledge and self-awareness.
When you think about who he has put himself in movies as, it's Jimmy from Pulp Fiction, who is a racist with a lot of linens.
Right.
Richie Gecko, who is a sex criminal who turns into a vampire.
Yeah.
Mr. Brown, right?
yes.
Right. The Australian guy who gets blown up at the end of.
That's right. Another racist piece of shit.
That's
slave
right.
trader who gets
In
blown up.
Inglorious. Is that it? When's the last?
Do you think he writes a film and then looks at it and says, "Who's the worst guy in this movie?"
No, I think he has parts in his movie, and he's like, the only man who can play this part is me.
Oh,
I love
he's also the voiceover in Kill Bill 2.
He's also the voiceover in The Hateful Eight.
Yeah.
He has become a narrator of sorts for his own films. There's a weird ballsiness to everything happening in From Dusk Till Dawn, and I feel like the movie's a little bit forgotten in time.
Yeah.
And it's important for me to note that he was a sex criminal vampire. What better ode
And
to QT's career?
Somehow thought he shared DNA with the most attractive man
I know, right?
since World War II. It was like, you know who I am the brother of? The sexiest man alive.
Any other lingering Quentin Tarantino thoughts, guys?
Let me ask. I broached this on the watch with Sean today, but I wanted to ask you.
Mhm.
So we got Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This is 9. One more movie.
Does his Star Trek movie
He
count?
says that is kind of a loophole. So he's like, if it is, who cares?
Sure.
But if I don't want it to be, I can do another one.
I will start by saying, bring me the Star Trek movie.
Yes.
I
Let
want
me
the
see
Star
the
Trek
Star-
movie.
I want it.
Do I want that to be the 10th movie? No. But I do. Really.
I
who-
want an
who
R-rated
cares?
Star Trek movie of these guys.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
But 10th movie, what kind of a movie would you want to see? What have we got? We've gotten Western, martial arts. We've gotten, a slave story. We've gotten a World War II story. We've gotten a true kind of crime pulp novel. We've gotten a thieves movie.
I would bring it back to where it all began in Res Dogs with the Silver Surfer on the poster. Give me the Fantastic Four Quentin Tarantino movie.
did
Wow.
Fantastic Four.
Feige, open your fucking ears
Yeah.
and listen up.
The Rocky guy. The Thing? Yeah. The Thing.
Yeah.
Give it to me.
Yeah.
Quentin Tarantino, Fantastic Four.
And that invisible bitch.
Yeah.
Great stuff from Holdaway in that movie. I love Holdaway. He's an underrated character. What about you, Chris? Fantastic Four is an amazing call.
I would be fine if he wanted to if now he wanted to do the Jackie Brown phase and just wanted to make 5 Elmore Leonard
Yeah.
novels.
Seriously.
Anyone you would pick out?
He could do Glitz. He could do Mr. He could do any number of them.
Yeah.
If he wanted to resurrect Raylan, I'm sure Timothy Oliphant would be absolutely.
Yeah, sign the check. Yeah.
Let's do Pronto. Let's
Yeah.
do let's do these. Man, I guess my cheeky answer would be go back to the Crimson Tide IP.
Oh.
Reboot that with Denzel in the Hackman role, and then have a new young XO
Man.
on a nuclear sub. Have another showdown.
I like
QT
that.
punching up that crimson dialogue, man.
I'd like to see him do something. He needs to be recognized, I think, for the artist that he is. And as you guys know, I'm obsessed with the Oscars and always talking about the Oscars. And he's not really been fully recognized as the kind of Oscar director that he should be.
Hmm.
And I feel like the way to do that is to make a movie that isn't as good as his other movies, but fits the format more clearly for what they want. And I think that there's a historical epic in him, a kind of Ben-Hur style movie.
Oh, wow.
Biblical?
Where he brings in the
Oh,
Tarantino
wow.
style, where the dialogue is very raunchy and low down and pop cultural to maybe the 500s. But
So he cast himself as Jesus.
that's the greatest story ever told, starring Quentin
Jesus dropping
Tarantino.
N-bombs.
Yeah.
And great coffee though.
Yeah, The Last Temptation of Jimmy. Guys, this has been very fun. Thank you so much for sharing your Quentin Tarantino top fives.